Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to 2-Minute Talk Tips. This week's tip, dim the lights. It continually amazes me just how many meeting rooms and conference rooms and ballrooms and event spaces have terrible localized lighting for projectors. The designers of these rooms know that they're often going to be used for presentations, and yet the lighting is still terrible. You see, while projectors have gotten brighter over the years, they still benefit from less ambient light. Plus, they have a very long life, which means there are a lot of older, dimmer projectors still in use when you try to make an impact with your presentation and slides. And if the room is too bright, your slides will look washed out and illegible. And instead of giving your audience an eye-opening experience, you'll just be giving them eye strain. So look for ways to make the area around the screen darker without putting yourself in the dark. Play with the light switches in the room to see if there is some way to shut off just a few lights near the screen. Make sure you close the blinds or curtains at any windows. You can try repositioning the projector and screen so the screen is in a darker part of the room. For a more radical solution, try contacting the facilities department where you're going to be presenting and actually ask them to remove some of the bulbs from the ceiling above the screen. They might not do it, but you can at least give it a shot. And of course, make sure the projector is in full power mode and not some low power eco mode. The key is to make sure that your slides pop on the screen. Make the projector brighter and make the screen area dimmer. Just stop short of nap conditions for your audience. Stick around, and after the break, we're going to talk about 7 strategies of master presenters. Welcome back. There are a ton of books out there about public speaking and presentation, and fortunately, I enjoy reading them. Last month in episode 26, I told you about storytelling with data. One of my first episodes was actually a look at a book called Talk Like TED, and this month, let's take a look at another book on public speaking. Dr. Brad McRae and David Brooks wrote The 7 Strategies of Master Presenters back in 2004. As of October 2017, it's actually selling for less than $6 on Amazon. That's a pretty good deal. You can search for it there or follow the link from episode 33 at 2minutetalktips.com. Even though the book is more than 10 years old, probably because it's not a technology or a social media book, it's still relevant. I mean, sure, there are some dated lines in there like, therefore, if you want to find the perfect quote, stimulate your thinking, and add focus and direction to your presentation, you may want to consider a computerized quotation program. But public speaking books that aren't tech books don't generally become obsolete. Oratory has been around for millennia, and communicating with an audience is, roughly the same as it was in the days of Cicero. I mean, sure, speakers of old didn't have PowerPoint, but they did have visual aids, and a lot of the same concepts apply. Presenters 30 or 50 years ago didn't have laptops, but they did have overhead transparencies and literal slides and slide projectors. We may talk a lot more about storytelling over the past 5 years or so, but stories have always been a part of effective oratory. So let's take a look at Brooks and McRae's book. I'll read a few passages and share my thoughts, and I'd love to hear your thoughts too. So to start with, what are the 7 strategies they're talking about? They are: first, know thy audience. Second, prepare outstanding content. Third, use superior organization. Fourth, develop dynamic delivery. Fifth, make it memorable, actionable, and transferable. 6, manage yourself, difficult participants, and difficult situations. And 7th, total quality improvement. What I like about these strategies is that most of them are focused on what you do before you even get on the stage, because the success or failure of a presentation is going to be determined well before that presentation actually begins. When they talk about the nature of oratory, Brooks and McCrae say this: 98 years ago, William Jennings Bryan wrote, "The age of oratory has not passed, nor will it pass. As long as there are human rights to be defended, as long as there are great interests to be guarded, as long as the welfare of nations is a matter for discussion, so long will public speaking have its place." They go on to say, "It is irrefutable that public speaking shall always have its place. However, it is indisputable that in the ensuing century since William Jennings Bryan wrote those words, the age of oratory has experienced significant change." Bryan also wrote, "The press, instead of displacing the orator, has given him a larger audience and enabled him to do a more extended work." The point here is that oratory now is just as important as it used to be. We simply have more tools at our disposal to spread our message even further. But regardless of what we come up with in those tools, regardless of the text nature of social media, there is always going to be a very strong place for public speaking, because there is really nothing that can sway an audience and give an audience that experience in quite the same way. Brooks and McCrae do talk about the importance of storytelling. To kick off the section on the perfect illustrative story, they quote Kouzes and Posner saying, "Experience is the best teacher, and when learning the aims of an organization, it typically takes form of critical incidents. These are the stuff of stories and legends." When you look at the life of an organization and you look at the critical things it has encountered, whether that be terrible quarters, tragedies, or even huge successful products or failed products, these critical moments, these tipping points in the life of an organization are where the stories of that organization come from. And when you're looking for a business story to tell, start looking for those critical junctures in an organization or a team's history. As presenters, one of the reasons why we have to rely on stories is, of course, to make that emotional connection with our audience. And that's something we've talked about several times in previous episodes. The other benefit of talking about stories and in making that emotional connection is that we can actually tie that story and that point more into the audience's experience and help them remember. Because otherwise, they are going to forget much of our content. Brooks and McCrae say, "Long after the participants have forgotten the topic of the presentation, even after they have forgotten the name of the presenter, they will remember a story." Therefore, master presenters have mastered the art of story construction and delivery. The perfect story not only makes the material memorable, but it also brings it alive for the audience. Like the perfect picture, the perfect story captures the essence of what needs to be learned. It's crafting those stories and telling those stories that will help that audience retain that lesson. They go on to say, Master presenter Bill Grove says, "Public speaking is simply this: make a point, tell a story." That's the essence of public speaking. Make a point, tell a story. He said that years after he will have spoken somewhere, someone will come up to him and say, "Bill, I still remember the story you told about." He said that proves the power of the story as example. Anchor every point with an example and make your examples through stories. Anytime we can go ahead and actually engage our audience in a more direct way and actually pull on their emotions, we as speakers actually have the ability to really make that much more of a lasting impact. And that's why we talk about storytelling in so many of these episodes. In this book, they of course go beyond the concepts of storytelling and actually get into some more of the concrete steps involved in crafting a presentation. I've talked in the past how the last thing you want to do when you start preparing your presentation is to open PowerPoint. That's basically the end of the process. You need to start by defining your message, by figuring out what results you want, and then by just collecting all of your ideas and then building into an outline and then fleshing out your outline. In this book, they talk about the concept of the zero draft. Brooks and McRae say, "There's a wonderful book titled Writing Your Dissertation in 15 Minutes a Day by Joan Bolker. In the book, Bolker talks about writing the zero draft. The zero draft is a private document designed for the writer to get his or her thoughts down on paper, which is also known as a brain dump. Bolker's next stage is writing a private document for the writer's eyes only. In that stage, the writer is trying to figure something out, to arrive at the truth to the best of his or her ability, and the writer is his or her own audience. At this stage, don't be a perfectionist, and remember what John Maynard Keynes said, it is better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. When you are writing everything but the final draft, give yourself permission to write notes in the margins about what you think, feel, have hunches about, and anything else that comes to mind about what you have written. In other words, you can produce a written dialogue, and that dialogue will help you develop both your thinking and your writing." What I like about this is that it, of course, emphasizes the idea of the early draft and just getting stuff down there. One of the things I have found helpful whenever I get stuck trying to write something or trying to come up with content is to specifically try to write things as badly as possible, just to get the brain moving and knowing that this is stuff that is never going to see the light of day, but it's part of the process. And the zero draft works that way as well. It's about getting the stuff out of your brain and onto the paper so that you can then start working with it. As part of that early prep work, I've talked a lot about the outline and working on from the outline of your presentation to develop that. And that can be a really useful tool for you. If you have a good outline, it's also easier to tell your audience where you are going to go with each of your points so they can see how this whole process is going to go out in front of them. And having an outline and actually forecasting for your audience and telling your audience early on what you are going to talk about and how you are going to talk about it gives them the framework they need to understand the material you are talking about. It helps them position it and categorize it in their minds. Brooks and McRae talk about an exercise they do in some of their training classes. They say, "One of the exercises that we use in our course, The 7 Strategies of Master Presenters, is an exercise in one-way and two-way communications. The exercise works like this. We select a participant from the course to be the communicator. He or she is given a diagram of 7 shapes, circles, rectangles, and squares, that are connected to one another. Using one-way communication, the communicator must describe, in as much detail as possible, the figures on the handout, while the listeners draw the diagrams to the best of their ability based only upon the verbal description. The communication can only be one way, and the communicator cannot use hand gestures, only his or her verbal skills, to describe the shapes in the diagram. The participants are not allowed to ask questions. The exercise is then repeated with a different diagram that uses the same shapes, but in an equally difficult arrangement. This time, however, the communicator and the listeners can engage in two-way communication. The quality of the diagram always improves when both the listeners and the communicator give each other feedback. The attendees ask for directions to be repeated, and both parties develop a richer way of communicating using angles, degrees, clock numbers, and analogies such as "it looks like a wagon" to make the communication richer, more thorough, and more precise. Every once in a while, a superb communicator volunteers for the role of describer. What is different about this communicator is that the volunteer intuitively understands the concept of advanced organizers. By this we mean that the volunteer will start saying, "I am going to describe a grouping of 7 shapes. There is 1 square, 2 circles, and 4 rectangles. or he or she will say, I will describe the shapes and their sizes in a minute, but before I do that, I want you to know that I will be describing the shapes in a clockwise direction. Advanced organizers create a frame of reference for what follows. When advanced organizers are used, the people reproducing the diagram are told how the communicator will proceed. That is, in a clockwise direction, and the diagram is made up of 7 shapes. Because the participants know how many shapes there are and in what directions the shapes will be described, it makes the whole process of understanding their task much easier. What I like about this section is it emphasizes, of course, 2 points. First, when you're able to actually interact with your audience, everybody can get a deeper understanding of what you're doing. But it also talks about the importance of that metadata, what you are going to be telling them. And when people know what they are about to hear and have that framework, it's a lot easier for them to take it all in and to get it right and to understand just what you're talking about. That's why it's so helpful at the beginning of a presentation to often tell people just what you're going to be doing. When we use stories to illustrate a point, it's important to actually go ahead and make sure we tie that story back into the audience. Because we can talk about the content we are sharing, we can talk about why something is important, and then tell a story. But then we have to make sure we connect that story with that broader point that we were making. Brooks and McRae go ahead and say, Alan Parisi states that the challenge of the presenter is to move from simplicity to complexity and then back to simplicity with depth. Metaphors are a good way to do this. Metaphors are also an excellent way to make your presentations truly universal, deeply personal, and eminently memorable. What I like about this is we're moving the audience from a point of they haven't heard this information in a very simple state. Then you're introducing the content and introducing a concept even that may be more complicated, that requires some explanation. And then you tell a story, build a metaphor, which gives them some more depth to it and really fleshes it out and helps make it more understandable. And then you can come back from that into the rest of your content, and we're back to simplicity, but with a much deeper understanding of where we are. And before we take the audience on that journey, we have to actually know where that journey is going. Before we can get someplace, we need to know where that place is. And that goes back to the very important part of the prep work as part of such an important strategic element of developing the presentation. Brooks and McRae go on to say, Craig Valentine, the 1999 Toastmasters World Champion of Public Speaking, says, one reason most speakers don't get their message across to an audience is because they don't know what their own message is. So before you speak or write a single word, you must determine exactly what you want the audience to think, feel, or do as a result of hearing you. Therefore, you need to ask yourself, what do I want my audience to think, feel, or do as a result of attending my presentation? If you don't know the point of your presentation, if you don't know what you want your audience to do, if you don't know what your call to action is going to be, then why are you doing the presentation? There has to be a purpose and a reason behind it. And it's important for you to go ahead and define that in advance so that you can make sure that everything else you talk about in your presentation aligns with that. And that's why I keep coming back to the idea of making sure that what you do in your presentation is effective so you can achieve the results and the goals that you want to achieve. But before you can do that, of course, you have to know what it is you want to achieve. Brooks and McRae continue to talk about the importance of connecting with your audience and the challenges presenters have with content retention for their audience. They say, research has shown that 24 hours after hearing a presentation, the listener will forget at least 50% of all the information presented. In 24 more hours, another 50% will be forgotten. That means in a mere 48 hours after hearing a presentation, no matter how attentive the listener is trying to be, no matter how good his notes are, he will forget 75% of everything the speaker said. And I've talked about this in multiple episodes. The ways we address that, again, by repeating what we're saying, by emphasizing that point, by going back on it again and again, by telling a story, by making that emotional connection, by giving the audience members something they can really hang on to and to internalize. And that's how you work to help them retain more information, or at the very least, make sure that they retain the correct information. If they're going to forget 75% of the content, if they are going to remember only 25% of the content, then it is our job as speakers to decide just what that 25% should be and make sure that they retain the 25% that we want them to retain. And that's why repetition becomes so important. Brooks and McCrae go on to say, if we repeat a fact 7 times, we increase our likelihood of remembering that fact by 80%. That is why master presenters repeat, repeat, repeat. Then they restate, restate, restate. There's a lot more in this book to recommend. It's not the most playful read all the time, but there's a lot to learn in it, especially the more timeless stuff that forms the foundation of public speaking. So check it out. Read more about the prep work you need to do as a speaker, about the importance of telling those illustrative stories, about how you can make that connection to your audience through metaphor, through storytelling, and through repetition. There's a lot of great stuff in the 7 Strategies of Master Presenters. So check it out. Have you read the 7 Strategies of Master Presenters? Let me know your thoughts in the comments for episode 33 over at 2minutetalktips.com. And do you have any questions about public speaking that you'd like me to answer on a future episode? Feel free to send them via email to bill@2minutetalktips.com or leave a voicemail at 650-TALK-TIP. If you enjoyed this episode, please go ahead and leave a rating and review in the Apple Podcast Store and share this episode with a friend, colleague, or relative. And as always, as you continue to grow as a speaker, don't get best, get better, and have a great week.